Hello, everyone. Today I'd like to talk about thinking about how to think about culture. This is an introduction to some basic ideas we need to think about when we talk about culture. Okay, first I'd like to talk about dichotomous thinking. Dichotomous means to cut one thing into two halves. So if you imagine there's one world and you cut it in half, and there's people A and there's people B, uh, and every time you talk about people A or talk about people B, you only talk about the differences. This is dichotomous thinking. For example, if you think about Japan and America, you might talk this way. We eat rice, they eat bread. We are short, they are tall. They're Christians, we're Buddhists. They're good at running short distances, we're good at running long distances. They push their saws, we pull our saws. They say everything they are thinking. We are reserved, we like this, they like that. We, they. Okay. If you use dichotomous thinking, it means you only think about the differences between two groups of people. Uh, you only think about the differences between two cultures. Of course, talking about the differences, knowing about the differences is very, very important. But if you only focus on the differences between two cultures, you're very likely to misunderstand many, many things. So let me give you an example. Many years ago, I was teaching in a junior high school, and we were using a New Crown English textbook, and the students were studying how to use the words how and what. For example, what a beautiful day, or how nice you are. So students were studying how and what. And the textbook uh, talked about the different gestures in different countries. Of course, gestures are different, and knowing about different gestures is very important. Let's read this passage. How useful gestures are, but there is one thing to remember, gestures are different in different cultures. The Japanese point to themselves with the forefinger to the nose. English-speaking people point with the thumb to the heart. What a big difference! Okay. Uh, Everyone, what do you think? You use your hand, you point to yourself to indicate yourself. Uh, According to this passage, Japanese people use their nose and American people use their heart. But basically, both people are pointing to themselves. Uh, is this a big difference or not so big difference? Uh, let's think about that. If you think, wow, Americans and Japanese they point at different places. They must be completely different. This seems a little bit a silly way to think to me. But you can make your own judgment whether this is a big difference or a little difference. In either case, this is a type of dichotomous thinking. Uh, One problem with dichotomous thinking is it leads to rigid thinking. Let's read these words written by Edward de Bono. The rigidity of classification leads to rigidity in the way things are looked at. In other words, if you look at the world and you say there's category 1 and there's category 2, and everything in the world we're going to put in category 1 or category 2. So there's like a tree, we'll put that in category 1. Uh, then there's a bird. Okay, let's put bird in category 2. And now we have a rock. But we only have two categories. So where are we going to put the rock? Are we going to put it in category 1 or are we going to put it in category 2? So we're in a difficult situation. So if we only make a very small number of categories, if we only divide the world into two things, then probably we're going to have a very rigid way of thinking. So this is one of the problems that can arise from dichotomous thinking. So what are some of the possible problems with dichotomous thinking? One is that we can rob people of their humanity. For example, if we say, oh, all Americans are Christian countries, so all people in America are Christians. No, they aren't. There's lots of different people with lots of different ways of thinking. And so if we say, oh, John, he's an American, so he must think this way, then we're not really looking at John as an individual. And so we're not treating him as a person, really. So we are stealing his humanity from him. Uh, when we use dichotomous thinking, we, they, we, they, this tends to push people apart, and it doesn't bring people closer together. It creates distance between people. And this does not lead to cultural understanding, this leads to cultural misunderstanding. And also, when you perceive things from a distance, when you see things from far, far, far away, many times you can't see them clearly. And if you try to look at another culture while you're remaining in your own culture, your perception is influenced by your home culture very, very much. So it's very, very difficult to see a foreign culture. And your thinking becomes very rigid. Now let's talk about perception a little bit. You can see a group of circles on the left and you can see a group of circles on the right. On each side, one circle is in the middle. Most people will say that the circle in the middle of the left side group is bigger. Actually, the two middle circles, the circle in the middle on the left side and the circle in the middle on the right side, they're the same size. But when we first look at this picture, our perception is usually a little strange, and we think the middle circle on the left is a little bigger. This shows us how our perception does not always tell us about reality accurately. Okay, which line is longer? There's a long line at the top and a long line at the bottom. Probably most people, when they first look at this picture, think, oh, the long line at the bottom is longer. Actually, as you probably now realized, both long lines, the long line at the top, the long line at the bottom, they're the same size. They just at first look like they're different lengths. So actually they're the same, but we perceive them, some of us at least, some of us perceive them as looking differently. So this is a perception problem. And what we think we see is not necessarily what is there. That becomes a very philosophical issue. We could talk for hours and hours and hours about that. So you remember we read Fish is Fish, and the fish never left his own culture, and he could only get information about foreign cultures from his friend the frog, but the frog wasn't a very good reporter of information. So finally, the fish's perception of birds was not very accurate. So because the fish could never leave his own culture, and because the fish had to think about that distant culture, that foreign culture, from a distance, the fish's perception was not very accurate. Okay, when we think about a culture, people in that culture have similar behaviors. Are they all exactly the same? Are they all clones? This is an interesting passage from a book called Culture Bound, asking the question, are people inside a culture, are they individuals or are they all clones? So let's read this together. Each person, wherever he dwells, is an individual, but an individual influenced by family, community, country, and even language. Certainly no culture is composed of herds of clones who have been defined by their environment. Nevertheless, each culture is fashioned by pervading and prevailing tenets, whether they are conscious or subconscious. Okay? So a culture is not a collection of clones. A culture is a collection of individuals who are influenced by the culture. Okay? A group of people who are influenced by the culture. So when you visit America, you will experience American culture, but each individual person is influenced by American culture to a different degree. So not every individual in that culture is going to be the same. That's obvious information. I know all of you know that. All of you understand that. But sometimes, because you forget that, it's easy to have a misunderstanding. It's very important to understand three aspects of human behavior. One is personal behavior. This means individual behavior. Second is universal behavior. This is behavior that all people do. And the third is cultural. So when people behave, they're influenced by their own individual personality, by their own individual desires, and they're influenced by the fact they're a human being, and human beings share many similarities. And they're influenced by the specific culture in which they live. And they have personal feelings, and they have universal feelings, and they have cultural feelings. And all these feelings are mixed up together. And these three different types of feelings influence their behavior. Okay? So this is important to remember. So what exactly is a culture? Well, one thing to understand is a culture is something that exists with a group of people. So culture and group of people are very much connected. So let's read this definition. What is a culture? A pattern of learned group-related perceptions, including both verbal and nonverbal language, attitudes, values, belief systems, disbelief systems, and behaviors that is accepted by an identity group is called a culture. This term, identity group, is very, very important because people belong to many, 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 many identity groups. Okay? Let's just read this. Every identity group has a culture of its own. Every individual person is a part of perhaps hundreds of different identity groups simultaneously. And one learns and becomes a part of all the cultures with which one identifies. When we talk about cross-cultural understanding or cross-cultural interaction, uh, we often think about understanding of different countries or communication between people living in different countries. But basically, cross-cultural interaction and cross-cultural communication is communication and understanding between people who belong to different groups. So a person from America, a person from Japan, they're talking. That's one type of cross-cultural interaction. But even inside of Japan, if there's a very young person and a very old person and they're talking together, there's kind of a young person's culture and there's an older person's culture. So that is a type of cross-cultural communication. Maybe there's a person at this university who went to Hokkaido, and maybe you grew up in Tokyo and you become friends and you're talking and you realize, wow, this person has a really different culture from me. This person has a different way of thinking, different ideas, different beliefs. So that is also cross-cultural communication. So this is very, very important to remember. A person's country is one group that a person belongs to, but each person belongs to, according to Singer, each person belongs to hundreds of different groups. Wow. Uh, these are just some identity groups that I belong to. And maybe, if you think of a group of American people or a group of people who were born in 1957, or an expatriate, a person who doesn't live in his own country, groups of expatriates. There's lots of different groups. I read the New York Times, so people who read the New York Times have a very similar way of thinking. So these are just examples of some of the groups I belong to. And each of you can think of a set of groups like this that you belong to. So Each person belongs to many, many different cultures. So what exactly is intercultural communication? Well, let's read this quotation from Singer. When people start to recognize that every human being is culturally unique, let's read that again. Every human being is culturally unique. They will begin to realize that every interpersonal communication is, to some degree, also an intercultural communication. Uh, if Yoko talks to Keiko, probably Yoko's set of identity groups and Keiko's set of identity groups are not going to be exactly the same. They're going to be a little bit different. So when they talk, maybe much of the time they feel like they share culture, but some of the time they may feel some cross-cultural interaction going on. So this is what Singer means. Every time two people talk, their identity groups are a little bit different. So their beliefs, their attitudes, their way of thinking are also a little bit different. No two people are exactly the same. So in that sense, you're always talking to a person who thinks, believes, behaves a little bit different than yourself. So every communication with every person is actually intercultural communication. This is Singer's idea, and I also agree with his idea. This is very simple but very important. Aren't we born with culture? The answer to this is no. Some people think that culture is related to your DNA, but actually it's not. Here's what Singer says. The son of two white parents will always remain white, no matter what happens to him after birth. But the son of two English-speaking parents may never speak English if immediately after birth he is raised by a totally non-English speaking group. Cultural inheritance is ever-changing. So no, culture is not genetic. Okay, another important point is cultural behavior. Some cultural behavior is observable, and some cultural behavior is non-observable. So how can we think about behavior? First of all behavior has a form. Form means something that you can see. For example, if I wave my hand, that is a form. You can see that. You can see that behavior. But what do I mean when I wave my hand? Do I mean goodbye? Maybe in some cultures I might mean goodbye. But maybe in some cultures this means I don't like you. I don't like you. Okay. So the form of the behavior is something that you can observe, but you can't always observe the meaning of the behavior. So behavior has form and meaning, and this is very important to understand. It's also important to understand that people do behavior at a certain time. They do behavior at a certain place. So when you talk about behavior, you also have to think about appropriateness. For example, you may have some behavior that you do all the time with your friends, but when you go to school and you go to class, you wouldn't do that behavior. Okay, so sometimes you have to remember that you have to find the right time and the right place for your behavior. You also have to know that culture is always changing. So Japanese culture in 1960 is not the same as Japanese culture in 2020. It's also important to understand about monochronic and polychronic culture. In a monochronic culture, people generally like to do one thing at a time. They like to focus on one activity at a time. But in a polychronic culture, people can do many activities at one time. So imagine you're a businessman living in a monocratic culture and you have a business appointment with someone living in a polychronic culture. So you go to their office, you give them your name card, and you're expecting to talk to them one-on-one. But while they're talking to you, they continue to talk to other people. And you are from a monochronic culture, so you'll probably think, wow, this person's really rude. I came all the way to visit him and he's talking to other people. But that person will think this is normal. Of course I'm talking to you, but I'm talking to other people too. This is what we do. So sometimes there's some confusion understanding behavior because some people come from a monochronic culture, some people come from a polychronic culture. Okay, another interesting point to understand about culture is uh, high context culture and low context culture. Uh, in a high context culture, uh, people don't feel they always have to tell another person everything they're thinking because people can understand things from the context, from the situation. So Chinese culture is usually given as an example of uh, a high context culture. So maybe in Chinese culture, people realize, oh, we can understand many things without talking. So I don't have to explain everything. Okay. And then a low context culture is the opposite. In a low context culture, people think it's difficult to understand things unless someone explains it very clearly. So in a low context culture, people tend to explain their ideas very clearly. Okay? Generally, Japanese culture is considered a high context culture, and American culture is considered a low context culture. So when a Japanese person and an American person talks, they may feel a little bit uncomfortable, like, oh, this person is talking really directly, or this person doesn't really say what they're thinking. So there can be some misunderstanding because of that. But remember, uh, American culture may be a low context culture, but there are many, many, many different uh, types of American, many different American individuals. Each individual person is different. So some Americans can deal with a high context culture very easily. Okay? You have to remember that yes, it's a low context culture. America is a low context culture. But each individual in that culture is a little bit different. And some individuals in that culture may be very good at dealing with a high context culture. Okay, sometimes when people talk about culture, they describe culture as an iceberg. A real iceberg in the ocean is a big piece of ice, and 90% of an iceberg is underwater, and only 10% is above water. So it's very easy to see the top of the iceberg, and it's very difficult to see the bottom of the iceberg. So you can't see most of the iceberg. This is why the Titanic ran into the iceberg and so many people were killed because they couldn't see the bottom of the iceberg. And when people talk about culture, people often say that culture is like an iceberg because there are some aspects of culture that are easy to see, especially like the clothes that people wear or the food that people eat. Those things are very easy to see. Or holidays and festivals, you can see people celebrating, you can see people dancing in the street. So those are things that you can observe, parts of culture that you can observe. But the most important parts of culture are usually things that you can't see. Uh, these these non-observable parts of culture are sometimes called deep culture. And this deep culture is probably the most important thing to see. But deep culture is also the most difficult part of culture to see. If you look at the bottom, on the right side near the bottom, it says expectations. So you can imagine, trying to have a foreign friend. But what does your foreign friend? I'm sorry, someone just knocked on my door. Let's continue. So expectations. You have a foreign friend, and probably this foreign friend has expectations of you, but these expectations are very difficult to see. So if you're going to be good friends, if you're going to have a nice relationship, you need to understand each other's expectations. But their expectations may be related to their culture, and your expectations may be related to your culture. And you may have some trouble because this is a part of deep culture. And deep culture is often something that's very difficult to see and very difficult to understand. Here's another way of looking at the cultural iceberg. So at the top of the iceberg is observable behavior. So, you know, if people are walking down the street or they're singing a song, you can see that. But why are they singing? Or what are they thinking when they're singing? Uh, this is related to their deep culture, their perceptions, their attitudes, their beliefs and values. And that deep culture is created by, you know, the place uh, where they grow up. So the climate and the geography and the nature of the population, the demographics, the economic situation, the type of economy, the nature of the media in that country, the type of news the media in that country publishes, the education system, the type of education, the ways of thinking, the ideologies that people have in that country, religious ideas, spiritual ideas. All those things affect a person's perceptions, attitudes, beliefs, and values. And those are things that are very difficult to see. What you can see is their behavior. You can at least see the form of the behavior. The meaning of the behavior may sometimes be difficult to understand. So what you can see and hear, you know, is you can hear people's words, their tone of voice, the way they talk. You can hear that. You can see their body language. You can see their gestures. But below all that are their beliefs, their values, their biases and prejudices, a world of experiences, fears, dreams, feelings, and all those things are part of a deep culture. And unless you understand all those things inside the deep culture, you're going to have lots and lots of trouble understanding and communicating with and dealing with people in a foreign culture. Okay, so that's kind of a basic introduction to culture. After you watch this, after you watch this 2 or 3 times, if there's something you want to ask me about, please ask me when we meet in class. Okay, have a nice day. Goodbye.